Every morning after losing the career he had spent nearly 20 years building, Ethan Carter quietly carried groceries up 3 flights of stairs, fixed broken lights, and cooked dinner for the lonely elderly woman who lived next door. He never asked for a single dollar. He never expected a word of thanks. Then, one rainy evening in late autumn, she collapsed without warning, and Ethan rushed her to the hospital before bringing her home himself. When he reached her apartment door and pushed it open, he froze completely. Standing inside, illuminated by the soft lamp in the hallway, was the very woman who had fired him without mercy only weeks earlier. His former chief executive stared back at him in complete shock, and in that single frozen moment, one impossible truth threatened to unravel everything she believed about the man she had once dismissed as replaceable. The city had already begun its slow surrender to winter, the kind of late November chill that settled into brick buildings and bare maple trees, turning sidewalks into rivers of gold and rust-colored leaves. Ethan Carter walked into the glass tower downtown that Tuesday morning, exactly the way he had walked in for nearly 2 decades, badge clipped to his belt, coffee in hand, mind already sorting through the day's priorities. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. The meeting invitation had simply appeared on his calendar the night before, unmarked, unexplained, scheduled for 9 in the morning in the 42nd floor conference room. He assumed it was routine. He was wrong. Victoria Hayes sat at the head of the long glass table when he walked in, 37 years old, sharp suit, sharper eyes, a woman who had taken over as chief executive only 4 months earlier, after the previous leadership had been quietly forced out by the board. She did not offer him coffee. She did not ask him to sit for long. Within 11 minutes, she explained that the company was undergoing what she called a strategic restructuring, that his role as director of operations was being eliminated effective immediately, and that his final severance paperwork would be delivered to his email by noon. She spoke in clean, clinical sentences, the kind that came from someone who trusted spreadsheets far more than she trusted people. Ethan did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He looked around the room at the 2 other executives seated silently at the table, men he had trained, men he had mentored, men who now stared at their laptops rather than meet his eyes. Nobody objected. Nobody spoke up on his behalf. The silence in that room said more than any words could have. And Ethan understood in that instant exactly how alone a person could be after 20 years of loyalty. He rose from his chair, buttoned his jacket, and looked directly at Victoria Hayes with a calmness that unsettled her more than anger ever could have. "I hope the company becomes what you believe it can," he said quietly, and then he walked out. He carried a single cardboard box down to the lobby. His old desk photographs, a chipped coffee mug, a faded notebook filled with 2 decades of handwritten notes. He did not cry in the elevator. He did not curse under his breath in the parking garage. He simply drove home through streets lined with falling leaves, the kind of afternoon light that made everything look softer than it felt. And by the time he reached his apartment building, something in him had already decided that self-pity was a luxury he did not have time for. He changed out of his suit, folded it carefully as though he might need it again someday, and walked directly across the hallway to knock on his elderly neighbor's door. Margaret Dawson answered slowly, leaning on her cane, 74 years old with silver hair pulled back, and eyes that had grown tired from years of quiet grief since her husband's passing. Ethan did not mention the layoff. He simply stepped inside and got to work, tightening the leaking kitchen faucet that had been dripping for a week, replacing the burnt-out bulb in her hallway, raking the small pile of leaves that had gathered on her narrow porch, and driving to the pharmacy to pick up the arthritis medication she had been putting off buying. Margaret watched him work for a long while before she finally asked the question sitting on her tongue. "You just lost your job today, didn't you?" she said. Not as an accusation, but as an observation only someone who had lived 7 decades could make. Ethan smiled, setting down the light bulb box, and answered without hesitation. "That doesn't change whether doing the right thing is worth my time," he told her, and the simplicity of that sentence settled into the room like warmth from an old radiator. That same evening, 30 floors above the city, Victoria Hayes stood at the window of her corner office, watching the lights of the skyline flicker on one by one as darkness fell. She had just ended a man's career in 11 minutes and felt nothing but the quiet satisfaction of efficiency. The sense that she had done what the numbers demanded of her. She did not know, could not have known, that at that very same moment, the man she had dismissed was kneeling in a stranger's small garden, gathering wet leaves into a trash bag with his bare hands, asking for nothing in return. Two worlds existed in that city that night, separated by 42 floors, and an entire philosophy of what it meant to matter. The weeks that followed were harder than Ethan had expected. He updated his resume, sent out application after application, and sat through interview after interview with hiring managers half his age, who scanned his experience with visible discomfort. Some told him he was overqualified. Others said his salary history made him too expensive to bring on at a junior level. A few never called back at all, the silence itself becoming its own kind of answer. Each rejection chipped away gently at the confidence he had built over 20 years. Though he never let it show on his face when he returned home each evening, he kept a small notebook on his kitchen counter. The same kind he had once used to track departmental budgets. Except now its pages filled with a different kind of accounting. He wrote down every company he applied to, every recruiter who promised a callback that never came, every polite rejection letter that arrived with the same hollow phrasing about moving forward with other candidates. Some nights he sat at his small table long after dinner, running numbers on his remaining savings, calculating how many months he could stretch his severance before something had to change. He never let the worry follow him across the hallway, though, understanding somehow that Margaret's small apartment had become the one place in his life still untouched by uncertainty. There were mornings when the weight of it all threatened to settle too heavily on his shoulders. When he sat in his car outside yet another office building, rehearsing answers to questions he had already answered a dozen times that month. He thought sometimes of the version of himself who had walked into that glass tower every day for 20 years believing loyalty and hard work guaranteed something permanent. That version of him had been wrong, and learning to live without that certainty took more strength than any interview ever demanded of him. Still, each time he crossed the hallway to knock on Margaret's door, something in his chest reset itself, reminding him that his worth had never actually depended on a title in the first place. What never wavered, through all of it, was his routine with Margaret. Every single day, rain or shine, he crossed the hallway to check on her. He carried her groceries up the stairs when the elevator was out of service. He fixed the cabinet door that no longer closed properly. He replaced the tiny batteries in her hearing aids without being asked twice. On the mornings her joints ached too badly for her to manage the short walk to her doctor's office. He drove her there himself, waiting patiently in the lobby with a magazine he never actually read. The other neighbors on the floor noticed, of course, the quiet man who never seemed to expect anything, who never posted about his kindness or made it a performance for anyone watching. They spoke of him warmly in passing, in elevators and mailrooms, calling him the kind of neighbor everyone wished they had. Ethan himself barely registered any of it as remarkable. To him, it was simply what a decent person did when someone nearby needed help, and he happened to have the time. Margaret, for her part, had begun to look at him the way a mother looks at a son, her eyes softening whenever he walked through her door, as though some old ache in her chest quieted a little each time he arrived. Sometimes, on the evenings when his own apartment felt too quiet, Ethan lingered longer than the tasks required, listening to Margaret tell stories about her late husband, a machinist who had built half the furniture in her living room with his own hands. She spoke of the son she had lost, Victoria's father, in a voice that still trembled slightly, even after all the years that had passed. And Ethan listened without interrupting, understanding grief in a way that needed no explanation between them. He had buried his own wife 6 years earlier after a long illness, a loss that had quietly reshaped the rest of his life, and something about Margaret's company made that old wound feel less isolating than it usually did. He never spoke much about himself unless she asked directly, and even then his answers stayed brief, careful, as though he had learned long ago that dwelling too long on sorrow only fed it further. Margaret respected the boundary without ever pushing past it, content simply to have him there, filling the silence of her apartment with the ordinary sounds of another person moving through it, footsteps in the kitchen, the clink of dishes, the low hum of the television turned to a volume she could actually hear. It was on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the layoff, that everything shifted without warning. Margaret had insisted on walking to the market herself that day, feeling stronger than usual, waving off Ethan's offer to drive her. Halfway through the produce aisle, her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed against a display of apples, sending fruit scattering across the tile floor. A stranger called for help. Someone else called Ethan's number, saved in her phone under a single word: family. He arrived within minutes, his heart pounding harder than it had in years, and scooped her gently into his arms before the paramedics could even finish loading their gurney. The emergency room moved with the particular slowness that terrifies anyone waiting for news about someone they love. Ethan sat in the hard plastic chair for nearly 2 hours, refusing the coffee the nurse offered him twice, his mind replaying the sight of Margaret crumpling to the floor over and over again. When the doctor finally emerged, the news brought a wave of relief through his chest. It was dehydration, combined with a minor drop in blood pressure, nothing life-threatening, though the doctor gently reminded them both that a woman her age living alone needed more consistent supervision than she currently had. Ethan drove her home himself that evening, the rain falling steadily against the windshield. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red through the wet glass. Margaret leaned her head against the window, exhausted but grateful, murmuring quiet thanks that Ethan waved away, as though gratitude embarrassed him. When they finally reached her building, he helped her out of the car with careful hands, guiding her slowly up the front steps and through the lobby, her cane tapping softly against the tile with every step. They reached her apartment door, and Ethan turned the handle, expecting the familiar quiet of an empty home. Instead, the door swung open to reveal a woman standing in the small living room, coat still on, keys still in her hand, clearly caught in the middle of arriving herself. The light from the hallway lamp fell across her face, and Ethan's entire body went rigid with disbelief. Standing before him, in the very apartment where he had spent countless quiet evenings, was Victoria Hayes, the woman who had ended his career in 11 clinical minutes only weeks before. Neither of them spoke for what felt like an eternity. Victoria's mouth opened slightly, her composed executive expression cracking for the first time in longer than she could remember. Disbelief flooding features that were usually so carefully controlled. Ethan felt something colder than shock settle into his chest, a strange, dizzying collision of two entirely separate lives suddenly crashing into a single doorway. Margaret, oblivious to the tension thickening the air around her, looked between the two of them with genuine confusion, her tired eyes narrowing with curiosity rather than alarm. "You two know each other?" Margaret asked, her voice soft and unknowing. Completely unaware of the storm her simple question had just unleashed, Victoria's gaze locked onto Ethan's, searching his face for some explanation that made sense of what she was seeing, some logical thread connecting the man from the conference room to the man now standing in her grandmother's doorway, with rainwater still dripping from his coat. Ethan said nothing at first, his jaw tight, his mind racing through weeks of quiet visits, groceries, repaired faucets, and long conversations that suddenly took on an entirely different weight. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of confession. Victoria's eyes moved from Ethan's face to her grandmother's, then back again, and something in her expression shifted from confusion into a dawning, uncomfortable realization. The air in that small apartment grew heavier with every passing second, thick with unspoken questions neither of them was prepared to answer standing in a doorway with rain still falling outside. Nobody moved, nobody breathed easily, and somewhere beneath the tension, an entire truth about who Ethan really was, a truth neither woman in that room yet fully understood, waited quietly to surface. It took nearly an hour. And 2 cups of tea, Margaret insisted on making despite everyone's protests, before the full picture began to assemble itself in the quiet living room. Victoria Hayes, it turned out, was Margaret Dawson's only granddaughter, the daughter of Margaret's late son who had passed away years earlier in a car accident that had left the family fractured and distant. Victoria had built her career with a relentless focus that left little room for anything else, including regular visits to the grandmother who had once been the closest thing she had to a mother. Victoria explained, almost defensively, that she had arranged for a home care service to check on Margaret twice a week, that she called every Sunday evening without fail, that she believed her grandmother was being properly looked after, despite the physical distance her career demanded. She had no idea, absolutely no idea, that the home care service had quietly stopped their visits months earlier, after a billing dispute Margaret had never mentioned to avoid worrying her. She had no idea that for the better part of a year, the person keeping her grandmother alive, fed, and safe had been a stranger from across the hallway. Margaret, settling into her favorite armchair with her tea cradled in both hands, began to fill in the details Victoria had never known. She spoke of the night Ethan had stayed until 3 in the morning when her fever spiked dangerously high, refusing to leave until it broke. She described how he had climbed onto the roof himself during a storm to patch a leak rather than wait weeks for a contractor Margaret couldn't easily afford. She recounted the groceries he brought without being asked, the medications he picked up on his own schedule, the countless small kindnesses that had never once come with an expectation of payment or recognition. Victoria listened with her jaw tightening more with every story, shame creeping slowly up the back of her neck like heat rising through her collar. This was the same man she had looked in the eye weeks earlier and dismissed in 11 efficient minutes. The same man whose entire 20-year career she had reduced to a line item on a restructuring spreadsheet. She had judged him then as a number, a cost center, a name attached to a salary she deemed excessive. Now, she was learning that same man had spent months caring for her own grandmother, with a devotion she herself had failed to provide. She remembered, with a growing discomfort, the last time she had actually visited her grandmother in person before that rainy evening, nearly 5 months earlier, a quick lunch, squeezed between 2 conference calls that had ended with Victoria checking her phone more than she looked her grandmother in the eye. She had told herself then that the care service handled the daily details, that a phone call every Sunday was enough to maintain the relationship, that success at the office justified the distance she kept everywhere else. Sitting now in that same living room, listening to a stranger describe nights he had spent nursing her grandmother's fever, Victoria understood how thoroughly she had deceived herself about what enough actually meant. Ethan, throughout all of it, remained quiet and reserved, offering no dramatic speeches, no accusations, no attempt to make Victoria feel worse than she already clearly did. He simply answered Margaret's occasional questions plainly, downplaying his own role whenever the conversation turned toward praise. When Victoria finally turned to him directly, searching for something, an explanation, an apology owed, perhaps even forgiveness she hadn't yet earned, Ethan only offered a small, guarded nod before excusing himself to check that Margaret's medication was properly organized for the following morning. He left shortly after, offering Margaret a gentle goodnight and a promise to check on her the next day as always, deliberately avoiding any prolonged exchange with Victoria at the door. She watched him go, standing frozen in the small entryway long after the door had clicked shut behind him, the weight of everything she had just learned, pressing down on her chest with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since taking over as chief executive, Victoria Hayes did not know exactly what to do next, and the uncertainty terrified her more than any boardroom crisis ever had. Over the following days, Victoria found herself unable to let the matter rest. She returned to the office and quietly pulled the personnel files from the restructuring decision, records she had approved without reading closely enough the first time around. What she found buried within the documentation made her stomach turn. The financial discrepancies that had supposedly justified Ethan's termination hadn't originated from his department at all. They had come from manipulated figures submitted by the chief financial officer, a man who had conveniently redirected blame downward before anyone thought to question the source. She dug further, cross-referencing meeting notes and internal emails that painted an increasingly clear picture. Ethan Carter had, in fact, raised concerns about certain financial reporting practices months before his termination. Concerns that had been quietly dismissed by senior leadership, eager to protect their own positions. Rather than being rewarded for his diligence, he had instead become a convenient scapegoat when the board began pressing for someone accountable. Victoria remembered the meeting now with a different kind of clarity, remembered how Ethan had sat perfectly still, never once raising his voice to defend himself, never once naming the people who deserved the blame he was quietly absorbing. She thought back to his final words as he left her office that day. The strange grace of a man who wished the company well even as it discarded him without cause. At the time, she had interpreted his composure as resignation, perhaps even weakness. Now she understood it as something else entirely. A dignity that refused to lower itself to the same pettiness that had cost him everything. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria Hayes sat alone in her glass office and admitted to herself, quietly and without excuse, that she had been wrong. The realization did not arrive gently. It sat with her through sleepless nights, through meetings where she found herself distracted, through moments alone in elevators where her own reflection in the polished metal doors seemed to accuse her of something she couldn't quite name. She had built her entire career on trusting data over instinct, reports over relationships, efficiency over empathy. Somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that this made her a stronger leader. Looking now at the evidence in front of her, she began to wonder if it had only made her a smaller person. Someone who had mistaken control for strength and distance for discipline for far too long. Determined to make things right, Victoria arrived at Ethan's apartment building one crisp evening carrying a leather folder thick with documents. Inside were an offer to reinstate him to his former position, a salary increase well beyond what he had previously earned, and a modest equity stake in the company as a gesture of formal apology. She knocked with more nervousness than she had felt walking into any boardroom in years, rehearsing her explanation twice in the hallway before he finally opened the door. Ethan listened patiently as she laid out everything on his small kitchen table, watched her hands tremble slightly as she spoke, noted the genuine discomfort in her voice that had never been there during their termination meeting weeks earlier. When she finished, he closed the folder gently without opening it fully, sliding it back across the table toward her, with a calm that unsettled her more than any anger could have. "I'm not angry with you," he said quietly, and the honesty in his voice was somehow more disarming than accusation would have been. "I don't need you to make up for it either," he continued, folding his hands together on the table. "I just don't want to work somewhere that measures a person's worth by a few pages in a quarterly report." Victoria sat in silence, the weight of his words settling over her far heavier than any spreadsheet ever had. She had come prepared for anger, for negotiation, even for outright refusal, but she hadn't prepared herself for the quiet dignity of a man who simply wanted something better than what she had offered him. She left his apartment that evening without the folder, walking slowly through streets lined with bare trees, her mind turning over his words again and again. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Hayes began to question not just a single decision, but the entire framework she had built her identity around. If a man's value couldn't be measured in numbers, she wondered, then what exactly had she been measuring all along, and what had that cost the people around her without her ever realizing it? In the weeks that followed, Victoria began doing something she hadn't done in years. She started visiting her grandmother regularly, not out of obligation scheduled between meetings, but because something in her had begun to ache for the connection she had let slip away. Her first attempts were clumsy in ways that embarrassed her. She burned the eggs twice trying to make Margaret's simple breakfast. She pulled weeds from the small garden bed, only to realize afterward she had also uprooted the tomato seedlings Margaret had been nursing all season. Ethan, still visiting daily out of habit and genuine care rather than any lingering obligation, found himself quietly stepping in to guide her without making a show of it. He showed her how to properly stake the tomato plants she had accidentally disturbed, how to season the eggs Margaret actually liked, how to recognize the subtle signs that Margaret's arthritis was flaring before she admitted it herself. Victoria absorbed each small lesson with a humility that surprised even her, the sharp confidence of the boardroom giving way to something softer and more patient. Slowly, the conversations between them changed shape entirely. They were no longer former employer and dismissed employee circling each other with caution and unresolved resentment. They became simply two people, sharing coffee on Margaret's small porch as autumn gave way fully to winter. talking about things that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or restructuring plans. Victoria found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, surprised by how much lighter she felt in the company of a man who had every reason to resent her and chose not to. She began asking him questions about his life before the layoff, about the son he mentioned only briefly and never elaborated on, about the wife he had lost years earlier to illness, a loss Margaret confirmed quietly one afternoon while Ethan was out running an errand. Victoria realized, with a growing tenderness she hadn't expected, that the calm dignity Ethan carried wasn't the absence of pain. It was pain that had been carried for a long time and somehow transformed into gentleness rather than bitterness, a transformation she found herself quietly admiring more each passing week. For Ethan's part, something in him began to soften as well. The careful distance he had maintained since that first uncomfortable encounter, slowly giving way to something warmer. He still hadn't fully forgiven the manner of his termination, but he found it increasingly difficult to hold on to resentment toward a woman who showed up week after week, hands dirty from gardening, laughter genuine, effort visible in every small thing she attempted. Margaret, watching the two of them from her porch chair, allowed herself a small, knowing smile she kept mostly to herself. Back at the company, matters were unraveling in an entirely different direction. The board had launched a formal investigation into the financial irregularities Victoria had uncovered. The chief financial officer had been manipulating quarterly reports for over a year, inflating certain figures, while quietly shifting blame for shortfalls onto departments he wanted eliminated for his own political advantage. Ethan's department had simply been the most convenient target, a scapegoat sacrificed to protect a much larger and more damaging deception. Several employees, emboldened once the investigation became official, came forward with testimonies confirming what Victoria had already begun to piece together on her own. They described how Ethan had repeatedly raised concerns in private meetings about questionable financial practices, how he had pushed back against decisions he believed were unethical, and how those objections had quietly marked him as a problem to be removed rather than a voice to be heeded. The picture that emerged was of a man who had been punished not for failing the company, but for trying to protect it. Victoria brought the full findings before the board herself, standing at the head of the same glass conference table where she had once dismissed Ethan in 11 clinical minutes. This time, her voice carried a different kind of authority, one rooted not in cold efficiency but in accountability she refused to shy away from. She laid out the evidence plainly, named the chief financial officer's misconduct without softening it, and then did something none of the board members expected. She formally apologized, in front of the entire room, for the harm her own hasty decision had caused a man who deserved far better from the company he had served loyally for 2 decades. Several board members pressed her afterward, privately, asking whether such a public apology had truly been necessary, whether it might invite unwanted scrutiny from shareholders looking for weakness at the top. Victoria answered each of them the same way, calmly and without apology for the apology itself, explaining that a leader unwilling to admit fault in front of the very people affected by it had no real claim to the trust leadership required. It was a different kind of confidence than the one she had walked into that boardroom with a year earlier, quieter, steadier, built on something more durable than certainty alone. The chief financial officer was terminated within the week. His contract dissolved amid the mounting evidence against him, and the board unanimously approved Victoria's proposal to formally invite Ethan back. This time, the offer carried none of the transactional coldness of her earlier attempt. She traveled to his apartment once more, this time without a folder full of paperwork, and simply asked him, as one person to another, whether he might consider returning not as an employee, but as a strategic partner with genuine influence over the direction of the company moving forward. Ethan sat with the offer for several days before answering, walking the same autumn streets that had carried him home the day he lost everything, weighing what mattered to him now against what had mattered before. He thought about the 20 years he had given to a company that discarded him in 11 minutes without a second thought. And he thought about the months since, months that had cost him financial security, but had somehow left him feeling more grounded than he had in years. Returning meant re-entering a world that had once hurt him deeply, and he needed to be certain that whatever pulled him back was worth more than the comfort of staying away. When he finally returned to Victoria with his answer, it wasn't the salary or the title that had persuaded him. It was something Margaret had said to him quietly one evening, that sometimes the universe removes us from a place only so we can return and build something better than what existed before. In the end, it was not the money or the title that decided it, but a quiet conversation with Margaret one evening, in which she reminded him that bitterness, however justified, only ever punished the person carrying it. He agreed to come back, but only on his own terms. Those terms became the foundation for a partnership unlike anything the company had seen under its previous leadership. Ethan proposed the creation of an employee support fund, a modest pool of resources set aside to help staff facing unexpected hardship without the fear of it affecting their standing within the company. He suggested a formal program connecting employees with elderly neighbors and family members who needed care, modeled loosely on the very thing he had done instinctively for months, without ever expecting recognition. He asked for designated volunteer days built into the company calendar, time explicitly protected for employees to give back to their communities without sacrificing their earned time off. Victoria approved every proposal without hesitation, understanding now in a way she hadn't before that a company's true strength lived not in its quarterly reports, but in the character of the people who built it day after day. The changes rippled through the organization slowly at first, then with increasing visibility as employees began to notice a culture shifting beneath their feet. Meetings grew less clinical and more collaborative. Leadership began asking questions about well-being rather than only output. The building itself seemed to breathe differently, as though it too had been given permission to soften. One of the first employees to benefit from the new support fund was a young woman in the accounting department whose father had been diagnosed with a serious illness that required expensive treatment. Rather than quietly struggling in silence the way employees once had under the old leadership, she was able to request assistance without fear of judgment, and the company covered a portion of the costs while adjusting her schedule to allow for hospital visits. Word of her experience spread quietly through the office, not as gossip, but as reassurance. Proof that the changes Ethan and Victoria had implemented were not simply promises printed in a company newsletter. The volunteer care program grew steadily as well, pairing dozens of employees with elderly neighbors and family members who needed regular assistance, mirroring the very thing Ethan had once done instinctively without any formal structure behind it. Some employees discovered, much like Victoria had, that the time spent caring for someone outside the walls of the office gave them a sense of purpose that no promotion or bonus had ever provided. Managers began noticing that teams participating in the program often worked more cohesively together, as though the practice of caring for others outside of work quietly reshaped how people treated one another inside of it. A full year passed, carrying with it the kind of quiet transformation that rarely makes headlines but changes everything that matters. The company Victoria led had become known throughout the industry not just for its performance, but for the way it treated the people who made that performance possible. Turnover dropped. Morale rose. Employees who had once dreaded restructuring announcements now spoke openly about feeling genuinely valued, a shift that traced back, whether they knew it or not, to one man's quiet insistence that kindness and competence were never mutually exclusive. Margaret's health had improved steadily over that same year, her strength returning gradually with consistent care, regular meals, and the simple comfort of no longer feeling forgotten by the people she loved. Victoria made the drive to her grandmother's apartment several evenings a week now. No longer an obligation squeezed between meetings, but a ritual she genuinely looked forward to, often arriving with groceries of her own or a new recipe she wanted Margaret's guidance perfecting. The small apartment that had once felt so quiet and isolating had become, once again, a place filled with warmth and conversation. Margaret liked to joke, on the evenings when both of them visited together, that her collapse in the produce aisle had turned out to be the luckiest fall of her entire life, a comment that always made Victoria wince slightly before laughing along with her. Underneath the joke, though, all three of them understood the deeper truth it pointed toward. Sometimes the moments that frighten a person the most, a collapse, a job lost without warning, a door opened onto an impossible coincidence, turn out to be the exact hinge on which an entire life quietly swings towards something better. None of them would have chosen the pain that led them there. But none of them, looking back now, would have traded away where it eventually led either. On a soft afternoon in early winter, the first snow of the season beginning to fall in slow, unhurried flakes across the city, Victoria asked Ethan to walk with her through the park near Margaret's building. They walked slowly, their breath visible in the cold air, the city around them muffled into a gentle hush by the falling snow. Victoria stopped near a bench overlooking a small frozen pond. Turning to face him with an openness she rarely allowed herself in any other setting. "I used to think being a chief executive meant learning how to lead," she said, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it in a boardroom. "It seems the first thing I actually needed to learn was how to be a decent person." Ethan studied her for a long moment, snow settling softly onto her shoulders, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tightly held for over a year. He reached out and took her hand, not because she led a company worth admiring, but because she had found the courage to change when so few people ever do. That evening, the three of them gathered together in Margaret's small apartment. The same rooms where an impossible coincidence had first collided two lives that seemed destined to remain separate forever. The table was set simply, the way Margaret always preferred, with mismatched plates and a pot of stew that had been simmering since early afternoon. Outside the window, snow continued to fall gently over the quiet street, blanketing the world in soft, forgiving white. Inside, warmth filled every corner of the small home, built not from wealth or status, but from gratitude, from forgiveness freely given, and from a love that had grown slowly out of nothing more than simple, everyday acts of kindness. Margaret watched the two of them across the table, her granddaughter and the man who had quietly become like a son to her, and felt something settle peacefully in her chest that had been missing since her husband passed. She thought of all the small mornings, the fixed faucets, the medication reminders, the quiet company on lonely evenings, and understood now that none of it had been ordinary at all. It had been the thread that eventually pulled two broken pieces back together, the kind of thread that never announces itself loudly but holds everything in place when it matters most. Ethan looked at Victoria across the table, the woman who had once ended his career in 11 cold minutes and had since become someone he genuinely respected and cared for, and felt no trace of the resentment he might once have carried. Life, he had come to understand, rarely moved in straight lines. Sometimes it took everything away only to lead a person, step by quiet step, towards something far more meaningful than what had been lost. He raised his glass gently toward the two women seated with him, toward Margaret's tired but happy eyes, toward Victoria's newfound softness, and toward a future none of them could have predicted the day a cardboard box and 20 years of loyalty walked out of a glass tower into the cold autumn air. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and steady, covering the sidewalks in white, the way time slowly covers old wounds when people choose, again and again, to be kind. Inside that small apartment, three lives that had been shaped by loss, by pride, by mistakes, and by grace, sat together in the glow of a single lamp, sharing a meal that tasted like something far richer than any dish could account for. It was, in the end, a simple truth finally understood. A person's worth was never written in a quarterly report, never measured by a title or a salary, but revealed instead in the quiet, unglamorous choice to show up for someone else, day after day, expecting nothing at all in return.